When I look at this image, I don't first think about threat assessment. I think about relationships. And for me, that's where the violence prevention begins. I have become convinced that while policies, organizational structures, and available resources differ across educational systems, relationships remain the foundation of effective prevention. Schools may look different from one country to another, terminology may differ, systems may differ, but every school depends on educators who notice when something changes, ask thoughtful questions, collaborate with colleagues and families, and remain committed to helping students succeed. Those are the relationships that make prevention possible. Throughout today's presentation, we'll talk about research, implementation, multidisciplinary teams, and organizational systems. But every one of those ultimately comes back to people, because every meaningful prevention begins with a relationship. And schools are uniquely positioned to build those relationships. One of the reasons schools play such an important role in violence prevention is that they occupy a unique position in a young person's life. Schools are uniquely positioned to notice. Young people come to school almost every day for years. Few other settings provide the opportunity to observe their growth, relationships, successes, struggles, and behavior over such an extended period of time. Because of that continuity, schools are often the first place where changes in behavior, emerging concerns, or other warning signs become visible. Educators notice changes in behaviors, changes in friendship, attendance, academic performance, emotional well-being. A single observation rarely tells the whole story. Patterns become visible over time, and again, schools are uniquely positioned to recognize them. That's an important distinction. Educators aren't expected to have all the answers. They aren't expected to predict violence. They are uniquely positioned to recognize when something has changed and bring that information to the team. No single educator sees the whole picture. Teachers, school leaders, counselors, psychologists, families, and community partners each bring a different perspective. Individually, those observations may seem incomplete. Together, they begin to reveal a pattern. Behavioral threat assessment builds on that strength. Rather than relying on assumptions or isolated observations, it brings together multiple perspectives to better understand a student's circumstances, identify strengths and protective factors, and determine the most appropriate path forward. Because schools are often the first place where concerning behavior or early warning signs become visible, they may also represent our greatest opportunity to intervene before problems become crises. That's exactly what behavioral threat assessment was designed to support. So now that we've talked about why schools are uniquely positioned to notice concerning behaviors, let's briefly define behavioral threat assessment and management, or BTAM. At its core, it is an evidence-based, multidisciplinary process that helps schools move from noticing concerns to understanding them and responding in ways that support students while reducing risk. It's important to understand what BTAM is not. It is not about predicting violence. It is not about profiling students, and it is not about waiting until a crisis occurs. Instead, BTAM brings together multiple perspectives to better understand a student's circumstances, the context surrounding the behavior, and the factors that may increase or reduce concern. In many ways, this approach is already familiar to educators. Every day, schools use collaborative problem-solving processes to address academic difficulties, behavioral concerns, attendance, and social-emotional needs. Educators gather information, work with colleagues and families, develop interventions, monitor progress, and adjust supports as new information becomes available. Behavioral threat assessment does not replace those processes. It applies those same principles when the concern is the potential for violence. The questions become different. The information we gather becomes more specialized. The stakes are certainly higher, but the goal remains remarkably familiar. Understand the situation well enough to determine the right response. That response is rarely a single intervention. It is typically a coordinated plan that may include counseling or mental health services, behavioral or academic supports, family engagement, mentoring, conflict resolution, safety planning, increased supervision, or collaboration with community partners. And that's why the word management is just as important as assessment. Assessment helps us understand the situation. Management guides what we do next. Together, they create a continuous process focused on prevention rather than a single event. As my own professional work increasingly focused on behavioral threat assessment and management, I found myself becoming just as interested in how schools implement the process as I was in the assessments themselves. So over the past several years, an increasing portion of my work has involved supporting schools as they responded to students whose behaviors raised concerns about the potential for targeted violence. That work gave me the opportunity to collaborate with multidisciplinary teams, review complex cases, and observe how behavioral threat assessment was being implemented across different schools and organizations. At the same time, the evidence supporting behavioral threat assessment continued to grow. Researchers were increasingly demonstrating that BTAM could be an effective framework for violence prevention. Schools were investing more time, training, and resources into implementation. And yet I kept seeing dedicated professionals work incredibly hard to do the right thing while navigating the realities of schools. The more I worked alongside those teams, the more I found myself returning to the same question. If we know so much about what works, why is implementation still so challenging? That wasn't a research question, it was a practitioner's question. How do we bridge the gap between what we know and what we consistently do? Because there was never a shortage of commitment, there was never a shortage of caring. And what I kept wondering was whether that gap between knowing what works and creating the organizational conditions that allow people to consistently do what works. I wanted to know whether implementation literature had been asking the same question. So the question I kept returning to wasn't unique. To better understand it, I did turn to that implementation literature, and what I discovered was both reassuring and encouraging. Researchers had begun to ask many of the same questions. The field had largely moved beyond asking whether behavioral threat assessment works. The evidence supporting BTAM had become increasingly strong, and so the conversation had shifted. So now researchers started asking different questions. How do we implement behavioral threat assessment well? How do schools move from evidence to everyday practice? What organizational conditions support successful implementation? And why do some schools sustain implementation while others struggled? As I read through the literature, I realized we had arrived at the same question from different directions. Mine began with practice, theirs began with implementation science. But we were ultimately trying to answer the same question. How do we help schools successfully implement what we already know works? So I began looking for an answer. And as I began reviewing the implementation literature, one pattern became increasingly clear. Researchers were approaching the same question from different perspectives. They studied different school systems, different implementation models, different aspects of behavioral threat assessment. But despite those differences, they kept arriving at many of the same conclusions. The organizational challenges I had been observing in practice were the very issues researchers were studying: leadership, training, organizational culture, resources, implementation fidelity, data systems. Different studies use different language. Different frameworks emphasize different factors, but together they pointed toward the same conclusion. Successful implementation depends on much more than simply having a behavioral threat assessment team. It depends on creating the organizational conditions that allow the process to function as intended. And if you're thinking about building or strengthening a behavioral threat assessment process, I think there's an important step that comes before any of this. Understand where you are starting. So before choosing a model, scheduling a training, assembling a team, take the time to understand what already exists in your school or organization. How are concerns currently identified? Where do people take those concerns? What do staff already understand about behavioral threat assessment? What resources and partnerships are available? And where are the gaps? Because you can't build an effective process around assumptions. You have to understand the environment you're building it in. Those questions became an important part of how I approached the implementation literature. And that's where I'd like to turn next, and that's to take a closer look at what the research tells us. So this would be one of those spaces where if there were any questions or comments that we're happy to take a brief moment and I'll take a sip of coffee.
Perhaps just to comment on that aspect, and I was up on busy, was about to type it into the chat anyway, is that we currently see it, whether it's in South Africa, whether it's in a corporate setting or in education setting, is that people's response to behavior is purely disciplinary in nature. You've done something bad, we're going to have a hearing to look at what you did, and then give some kind of punishment if we think you're guilty of whatever you're accused of doing. And I think for me, the biggest challenge has always been trying to make people understand that a behavioral threat assessment process is something separate to that. They're not gathering the same kind of information. They both might originate from a problematic behavior that occurred, but the behavioral threat assessment process, it's about helping something not get worse. It's about preventing what we may be worried about from happening. And it's therefore helpful to both that person who might be the origin of the concerning behavior and the whole community. And if we do our jobs right, you're going to stop that person from doing something bad, which is good for him or her, and of course is indirectly therefore directly good for the rest of us. And to try and convince people that those are separate concepts. They don't serve the same purpose. They cannot serve the same purpose, and the same people can't be doing the same thing. And that's always been such a struggle to make people understand that it's something completely different to what you might already have in place, and they don't serve the same function.
That is a great comment to add just right there before we get deep into the literature, or sort of deep. So thank you for that. So let's keep moving. And again, I'll make sure we stop so that if there's some comments, questions, and just general chit chat, we are open to that. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about what the literature revealed. But before we look at the findings, I want to make one brief point. Much of the implementation research I'll reference over the next few minutes comes from the United States. So although our educational systems differ, I think you'll recognize that many of the organizational questions researchers identified are remarkably familiar across schools and countries. As I reviewed the implementation literature, one pattern became increasingly clear. Researchers were not describing a single barrier to implementation. They were describing an organizational system. The same themes appeared repeatedly across studies: leadership, training, organizational culture, resources, implementation fidelity, data systems. Each influences implementation, but perhaps more importantly, they influence each other. And that's an important distinction. Schools rarely struggle with only one of these conditions. Limited resources affect training. Training influences implementation fidelity. Leadership shapes organizational culture. Data systems influence continuous improvement. Each condition makes the other one easier or harder to sustain over time. So although we'll discuss these 6 themes one at a time, I would encourage you not to think about them as 6 separate boxes. Think about them as an interconnected organizational system, because that's exactly how the implementation literature describes them. So let's begin with our first organizational barrier. Okay. At first glance, these findings from the 2025 RAND study, conducted in collaboration with the U.S. Secret Service National Threat Assessment Center, or NTAC, are encouraging. The study found that 85% of U.S. schools reported having a behavioral threat assessment team. That's significant progress. It reflects how far the field has evolved, but the study didn't stop there. The researchers looked beyond whether schools had teams and asked how those teams were actually implementing behavioral threat assessment. That's where the picture became much more complicated. Although most schools reported having a team, many also reported relying on locally developed procedures, informal practices, or modified versions of established models rather than validated evidence-based frameworks. It's important to recognize that every education system adapts implementation to fit its own legal framework, available resources, and local contexts. And I would expect that to be just as true in South Africa as it is in the United States. So the implementation question isn't whether every school looks identical. It's whether those local adaptations preserve the core components that make an evidence-based model effective. The implementation literature consistently reminds us that the strongest evidence is tied to a relatively small number of well-defined frameworks. As implementation moves further from that evidence-based model, it becomes increasingly difficult to know whether we're still achieving the outcomes described in the research. So having a team is an important first step. Implementing an evidence-based model as it was designed allows us to have confidence in the outcomes. And this naturally leads to the next implementation question. So let's go ahead and turn to our second organizational barrier identified in the implementation research. How prepared are educators to use behavioral threat assessment before they receive formal training? The answer, according to the research, is not very prepared. In one of the foundational studies examining threat assessment knowledge, educators completed a knowledge assessment before receiving formal training. The results were striking. Pre-training accuracy ranged from 26 to 36%. Teachers scored the lowest. Even the highest performing group, mental health professionals, answered correctly only about a third of the time. So let's just think about that for one moment. 36% was the highest score. Fortunately, this isn't where the story ends. The same research found that knowledge improved substantially after educators received structured training. And that's encouraging because it tells us something important. Behavioral threat assessment can be learned. While professional preparation programs, training pathways, and staff roles naturally differ across educational systems, the broader implementation question remains remarkably consistent. How do we prepare people to carry out this work with confidence? The implementation literature offers a clear answer. Training should not be viewed as a single event. It should be viewed as an ongoing process that includes opportunities to practice, receive feedback, and reinforce learning. Training is where implementation begins. It is not where implementation ends. And I know for many of you in the educational world, we see that across a variety of initiatives that come in schools, whether it's around reading or social emotional support or behavior, positive behavior, whatever it is, that schools are moving towards, we see that same sort of implementation question, and training is where it begins. And we also know it's not where it ends. All right. Our third organizational barrier identified in the implementation literature is the staff reluctance and staff buy-in. So the implementation literature suggests that reluctance is often more complex than simple resistance to change. The researchers found that when educators have a limited understanding of behavioral threat assessment, they are more likely to perceive it as punitive, exclusionary, or primarily disciplinary. And those perceptions influence whether staff recognize concerning behaviors, make referrals, or actively participate in the process. Fortunately, the research also points towards a solution. As educators receive training and develop better understanding of behavioral threat assessment, their attitudes begin to change. Participants demonstrated greater confidence in the process, they became less supportive of zero-tolerance approaches, and they increasingly viewed behavioral threat assessment as a framework for prevention, early intervention, and student support. So organizational systems naturally differ in their organizational culture, but the broader implementation question is again remarkably familiar. How do organizations build understanding, trust, and shared ownership? The implementation literature consistently points towards leadership as part of the answer. When leaders participate in training, reinforce expectation, and visibly support implementation, organizations are more likely to develop the culture necessary to sustain behavioral threat assessment over time. Policies matter, training matters, but culture ultimately determines whether implementation becomes part of everyday practice. And this naturally leads to the next implementation question, which is, even when organizations understand the process and support it, do they have the capacity to sustain it over time? Across the implementation literature, researchers consistently identified organizational capacity as one of the greatest challenges to long-term implementation. Although educational systems differ in how they organize services and allocate personnel, the underlying implementation question is remarkably familiar. Do schools have the people, time, and resources needed to carry out this work well? The literature points to 4 reoccurring capacity challenges. First, people. Many schools have limited access to behavioral health professionals needed to support comprehensive implementation. Second, time. Behavioral threat assessment rarely replaces existing responsibilities. Instead, it becomes one more responsibility among many competing for limited time and attention. Third, services. Identifying a student's need is only part of the process. Schools also need to access community mental health providers, intervention programs, and other resources to implement effective management plans. When those services are unavailable or difficult to access, even thoughtful assessments can be difficult to translate into meaningful support. And finally, continuity. Staff turnover can gradually erode institutional knowledge, implementation expertise, and community partnerships unless organizations have systems in place to sustain the work over time. None of these challenges suggest that schools lack commitment. Quite the opposite. They illustrate that successful implementation depends on organizational capacity just as much as individual effort. Even the strongest evidence-based framework requires people with the time, expertise, and organizational support to implement it consistently. Implementation is not sustained by commitment alone. It is sustained when organizations have the capacity to support the work over time. And that will lead us to our next implementation question is, how do we ensure behavioral threat assessment is implemented fairly and consistently for every student? As behavioral threat assessment has become more widely implemented, researchers have begun asking an additional question. Is the process itself protecting students? That's an important evolution in the implementation literature. Successful implementation isn't measured solely by whether violence is prevented. It is also measured by whether the process is applied fairly, thoughtfully, and in a way that respects students' rights, developmental needs, and individual circumstances. One area receiving increasing attention involves students with disabilities. A recent study by Cornell and colleagues found that 41% of threat assessments involve students with disabilities. That finding doesn't tell us whether the process itself is fair or unfair. It does remind us that disability requires thoughtful consideration, appropriate procedural protections, and coordination with existing educational supports. Although legal frameworks naturally differ across educational systems, the broader implementation questions, again, remarkably familiar. How do we ensure every student receives the same thoughtful, evidence-informed process while recognizing that every student's circumstances are unique? The implementation literature increasingly suggests that high-quality behavioral threat assessment shares these 3 defining characteristics. It is fair, it is developmentally appropriate, and it is legally sound. These principles don't compete with one another. They work together to protect students while strengthening the integrity of the assessment process. Effective implementation isn't simply about identifying risk. It is about protecting students while protecting the integrity of the process. And that will bring us to our final implementation question, which is, what organizational systems can help sustain high-quality implementation over time? Across the implementation literature, researchers consistently identify data infrastructure as an essential but often overlooked component of successful implementation. Although data systems naturally differ across educational settings, like everything else we've discussed, the underlying challenge is similar. Organizations can only learn from decisions they are able to examine. Many schools lack systems for consistently tracking referrals, documenting decisions, monitoring interventions, and evaluating student outcomes. Without that information, it becomes difficult to answer some very important questions. Did the intervention help? Is the student doing better? are similar concerns appearing across multiple cases? What should we do differently next time? Without meaningful data, organizations simply have no reliable way to know whether their decisions are improving the outcomes for students. But the literature also reminds us that collecting data is only the beginning, because collecting data doesn't improve student outcomes. Learning from data does. When teams regularly review information, evaluate outcomes, and adjust their practice, they create a continuous cycle of learning that strengthens both implementation and student support. The literature also highlights another important reality. Sometimes a team conducts an excellent assessment, identifies exactly what the student needs, and develops a thoughtful intervention plan, only to discover that the necessary services aren't available. A provider has a long waiting list, the community lacks specialized resources, or the family simply can't access the recommended supports. In those situations, the assessment hasn't failed. The team hasn't failed. The system lacks the capacity to deliver the intervention the assessment identified as necessary. Data-informed decision-making helps organizations learn, improve, and ultimately achieve better outcomes for students. And as helpful as I found this body of research, I kept coming back to the same thought. The literature gave me the language for many of the organizational challenges that schools experience, but it still felt incomplete. Because alongside of those educational barriers that I just shared, I kept seeing another side of implementation that wasn't being discussed nearly as often, the human side. And that's where I'd like to spend the rest of our time together. And before we move on to the human side, I would like to open it up for any questions about any of the literature that I reviewed that was around the organizational barriers. Comments? I'm going to go ahead and leave this to you, Gerard, if you can help me out.
Yeah, I see Dan has just raised his hand. I see Malcolm had a comment in the chat. I don't know whether it's better answered here, but is there expectation that high school BTAM teams would share information about a person of concern with the colleges or universities that they're going to attend? And we saw that perhaps a good example of that not happening was in the Virginia Tech shooting, where that kid had a lot of challenges early on in high school and before that, but none of these concerns were communicated to the university. Not that he's going to harm someone, but he was the kid who really just needed support when he arrived at the university, and that wasn't in place because nobody knew that. And I know that the legal issues would come into play here.
So let me ask exactly what the question is would the school share that to the higher ed? Is that the exact question? So this is a tough thing to address because there are laws around confidentiality. And I think the bigger issue for that particular case is that if you look back through, because I actually worked in the district where that student graduated from, there were not systems in place for early prevention. So because there were no real systems in place, there wasn't really information to share. It was siloed in many ways. And so it wasn't like, well, we've done this behavioral threat assessment and here's this package and it can go to a college. Should a college inquire about it? So that is probably more of the issue that was going on in that case. And there are efforts being made to make that kind of information available while being mindful of protections. So just because an individual had a behavioral threat assessment in the K-12 setting does not mean it's going to follow them somewhere. And it does become part of a school record. So if there was a reason to access the school record, it's there.
As Kristen points out, the challenges, the privacy law is going to differ from state to state and let alone country to country.
Yep.
I see, Dan, you've raised your hand. Do you want to ask your question live?
Thank you. Yeah, no, I was just going to say something that really resonated with me because in my work, I work with a number of K through 12 schools, summer camps, preschools, and this applies, I think, more broadly to the threat assessment and management world, which is that part of our job is preventing people from doing things quickly. And when you mentioned the piece about, I think, 1/3 of mental health professionals and maybe 2/3 of teachers, I can't, and I'm sure this will resonate with others too. I can't tell you how many times we've had to slow people down and say, your school mental health professional will have a role to play. Or in the private and independent schools, yes, your board member who's a psychologist may have a role to play in this. But what's their background? What's their training, right? Because, I know from my own experience working with a lot of really incredible mental health professionals who specialize in this area, it's a specialized thing, right? And so it really resonates and I think sort of validates my anecdotal perception of the lack of knowledge. Sometimes people want to help more than they're capable of, right? So it's about channeling them into the right direction. But thank you for that. I thought it was very interesting.
I really appreciate you saying that, Dan, and mainly because it's the practitioner question in me, and you're about to get into this human side. So it was funny, we were talking a little bit earlier. Sometimes people bring things up in questions or comments that we're about to get into, and I think that part of this is that human side as well as that specialized training. So thank you, Dan, for that segue. So I'm going to go ahead and go on. And again, please feel free to drop questions in the chat and share because I just love the interaction with others in this field. And I appreciate all of you being here. So let's get into it. The human side. So we spent the first part of our time here together looking at behavioral threat assessment through that lens of research. And then the implementation literature helped explain the organizational conditions that support successful implementation. So we talked about leadership, we talked about training, we talked about culture, resources, implementation fidelity, and data systems. And those lessons are incredibly important. But the research can only tell part of the story because implementation isn't something organizations experience. People experience it. And the more time that I spent working along these teams, the more I realized that every implementation decision is experienced by real people. People with different professional backgrounds, different responsibilities, and different reasons for choosing this work. So over the years, both through my own work and through conversations with educators, administrators, school mental health professionals, and school resources officers, I kept hearing many of the same concerns. And what surprised me wasn't how different the conversations were, it was how similar they were. Regardless of school, role, or experience, many of the same themes surface again and again. And as I reflected on those conversations, I realized they all had one thing in common. They weren't really about behavioral threat assessment. They were about the human experience of implementing behavioral threat assessment. And for the rest of our time together, I'd like to explore that human side of implementation, because if we want implementation efforts to succeed, we need to understand not only the systems that support the work, but also the people doing the work. So let's begin where many of those conversations began, which is professional identity. Now, I know many of you are educators, and for those of you who are not, I'm going to invite you to do a little visual. I want you to think about your own school or schools that you've been in. Just pause, walk down any hallway, look at the classroom doors, and you will see messages about kindness, relationships, belonging, making a difference. I've worked in schools for over 20 years, and I have never walked past a classroom door that said, assess whether this student is capable of planned violence. And yet, many of us eventually finding ourselves carrying that exact responsibility. For many educators and student support professionals, this is where implementation becomes personal. Most preparation programs teach us how to build relationships, how to earn trust, how to support students, how to teach, how to counsel, how to advocate. Those responsibilities aren't just part of the job. For many of us, they're part of our professional identity. What most of us were never trained to do was assess whether a student might be moving towards targeted violence. And I think it's important that we acknowledge what that can feel like. because the tension isn't simply about learning a new process. It's about reconciling two responsibilities that can initially feel very different. On one hand, we're trying to build trust, strengthen relationships, and support young people. On the other hand, there are moments when we're asked to initiate a process that could involve law enforcement, emergency mental health services, disciplinary action, or other interventions. In my experience, that tension rarely shows up as resistance. It shows up as hesitation, giving a situation one more chance, wanting just a little more reassurance, hoping the concern resolves on its own, or quietly wishing someone else would make the decision. I don't see those reactions as weakness. I see them as a very human response to work that carries significant emotional and ethical weight. The problem isn't that people experience the tension. The problem is that we often ask people to carry it without ever acknowledging that it exists. And when we don't acknowledge it, that tension can begin to influence implementation. Not because people don't care, but because the uncertainty can influence whether concerns are referred, how thoroughly they're explored, or whether the process is activated at all. What I found over time is that the strongest teams eventually reach a different understanding. They stop seeing student support and student safety as competing priorities. They begin to recognize that protecting students is supporting students. The goals aren't in conflict. They're part of the same mission. And helping people make the shift is one of the most important parts of successful implementation. And we'll get to the flip side of that as well. The next reality for me has to do with how behavioral threat assessment teams are actually formed. And I think this is a question we don't ask often enough. How do the people sitting around the table end up there in the first place? As behavioral threat assessment has evolved over the years, one recommendation has remained remarkably consistent. The work should be carried out by a multidisciplinary team. And I think that's one of the greatest strengths of the model. No single professional sees the whole picture. The teachers bring one perspective, the school leaders bring another, counselors, psychologists, social workers, and school resource officers each contribute different information, different expertise, and different relationships. And depending on the concern, teams may also need to collaborate with professionals or agencies outside of the school. Together, those perspectives help teams make better decisions than any one person could make alone. But that recommendation also created an interesting implementation reality. In many schools, people don't join a behavioral threat assessment team because they intentionally pursued the work. They join because of the position they already hold. The counselor is invited because counseling is connected to student support. The school leader because administration needs representation. The school psychologist or other mental health professional because of expertise in assessment and student support. Or perhaps they are a mental health professional outside that ends up on a team. So Dan, you got me on that one. And a teacher because they know the student. Other professionals or community partners may be involved depending on the concern or the resources available in that setting. In other words, your job title often determines your membership. And I can actually see that evolution reflected in my own career. When I first became involved in threat assessment, schools weren't typically using multidisciplinary teams. My role as the school psychologist was to conduct the mental health assessment as one part of the overall process. As the field evolved and the research grew and school practices changed, my role changed too. I became part of a multidisciplinary team. This wasn't because I decided to specialize in behavioral threat assessment. It was because my professional responsibilities evolved as the field evolved. Over time, though, something unexpected happened. I actually found the work fascinating, so I began pursuing additional training, consultation, and professional development. And eventually what began as assigned responsibility became an area of specialization. And the reason I share that story isn't because I think it's unique. I suspect many professionals arrive at this work in much the same way, not because they sought it out, but because it became part of their role. And I think that's an important implementation lesson here. The issue isn't about capability. Schools are filled with talented, deeply committed professionals. The issue is preparation. Behavioral threat assessment asks people to apply a specialized set of knowledge and skills that often extend beyond their original professional preparation. That's why training matters. That's why consultation matters. That's why ongoing support matters, because there's an important difference between assembling a multidisciplinary team and building a multidisciplinary team. Okay, so our next reality. Once somebody has been assigned with this responsibility, the next step usually seems straightforward. We schedule a training. I want to be very clear about something. Training matters. Every successful implementation effort begins by helping people understand the process. But over the years, I've come to believe that one of the biggest misconceptions in implementation is assuming that training and readiness are the same thing. They're not. So I know we run on different calendars, but we are back to school here in the States. Our kids come back on Monday. So we came back this week. So it is the beginning of the school year for many individuals in the United States. The school building is reopening. So if you could take it and picture the beginning of your school year, schedules are changing, teachers are doing their classrooms, administrators are solving 100 different problems, the emails are piling up, families are calling, students are about to arrive, and then somewhere in that first week there's behavioral threat assessment training. I think it's important to consider the context in which training is being received. The people that are sitting in the room aren't resistant to professional learning. Quite the opposite. Education is filled with ongoing learning. New initiatives, curriculum updates, technology, safety procedures, compliance requirements. Professional development has become part of the job. Over time, educators become remarkably skilled at deciding what needs immediate attention and what can wait, and what they can come back to later. After a while, this isn't resistance, it's survival. So what happens is entirely understandable. People attend the training, they participate, they receive excellent materials, then they return to their everyday practice, the realities of their everyday practice. The problem isn't the training. The problem is assuming the training is enough. Behavioral threat assessment isn't something we learn once and pull off a shelf 3 years later when a complicated case walks through the door. It develops through use, through conversation, through consultation, through working through real situations together. That's where the confidence grows. I've attended excellent trainings. I've worked alongside excellent trainers. But what happens after the training is just as important as what happens during it. Do the teams ever come back together? Do they work through scenarios? Do they consult with one another after a difficult case? Do they have the opportunity to reflect on what went well and what could be improved? Those are the experiences that transform information into confidence. And over the years, I've noticed something else. The schools that seem the most comfortable using behavioral threat assessment usually aren't the ones with the thickest training binders. They're the schools where recognizing concerning behaviors, sharing information, collaborating across disciplines, and responding early to student distress have become part of everyday practice. In those schools, activating a behavioral threat assessment process doesn't feel like launching a separate initiative. It feels like a natural extension of the work they are already doing. And I think that makes all the difference. The next reality has to do with something that's unique to behavioral threat assessment: the time between learning the process and actually needing to use it. Most of us become comfortable with a skill because we use it regularly. Teachers teach every day, administrators solve problems every day, school counselors counsel every day, psychologists conduct evaluations every day. But behavioral threat assessment is different. For many schools, it's a low-frequency responsibility. A team may receive training and then not formally activate the process for months, sometimes even longer, and that's actually a good thing. We want schools where serious concerns are relatively uncommon, but it creates an interesting implementation challenge. By the time the first significant case arrives, people may remember the general concepts while struggling to recall the details. Where do we start? Who needs to be involved? What information do we need? Which forms do we use? What happens next? I've heard more than one person say, "Someone go find the binder." And I don't think that's a reflection of poor training. I think it's a reflection of the nature of the work. Behavioral threat assessment is a low frequency, high consequence responsibility. Those are exactly the kinds of skills that require intentional reinforcement. The implementation literature tells us that fidelity naturally declines over time without opportunities to practice and reinforce new skills. I think school teams experience that reality in a very practical way, not because they don't value the process, but because they simply haven't had opportunities to use it. That's why I believe implementation can't end with the initial training. Teams benefit from periodically revisiting the process, working through tabletop scenarios, reviewing cases together, talking through roles and responsibilities, not because they're expecting the next case, but when it does arrive, the process should feel familiar. The goal isn't simply to remember where the binder is. The goal is to remember how the team works together. And our next reality is, we talked about how the previous slide focused on what happens when teams go long periods of time without using the process. That raises another question, though, is how do concerns reach the team in the first place? And I think this is one of the most important implementation questions we can ask, because schools are not short on concerning behaviors. Educators respond to concerning behaviors every single day. A threatening statement, a significant change in behavior, a concerning social media post, a fixation on another student, escalating conflict. Those situations occur in schools. The question isn't whether the concern exists. The question is what happens next. Most concerns should not become a formal behavioral threat assessment. Many are appropriately addressed through classroom supports, problem solving, mental health interventions, discipline, or other school-based services. That's exactly what we hope to see. Behavioral threat assessment isn't designed to replace those responses. It's there for the relatively small number of situations where a multidisciplinary conversation would help determine what comes next. And I think that's where implementation becomes especially important. Sometimes one person sees a discipline issue, someone else sees emotional distress, someone else sees a student struggling socially. Each perspective may be accurate, but no one person sees the entire picture. That's exactly why the multidisciplinary teams exist, because no one person has the answer, but several people together may notice a pattern that no individual could see alone. And I've experienced that myself. There have been times when I recommended looking at a situation through a behavioral threat assessment lens, and others saw it differently. Not because they were careless, not because they didn't care. They were simply viewing the same student through a different professional lens. And honestly, that's exactly why multidisciplinary teams are designed to address that. The goal isn't to prove someone right. The goal is to bring different perspectives together before important decisions are made. Which brings me to something I think about often. When I hear a school had no behavioral threat assessment activations, my first response isn't celebration. It's curiosity. What concerns arose during that time? How were they interpreted? How were they addressed? Did everyone share the same understanding of when a multidisciplinary conversation would be helpful? And that raises another practical question. Do the people in the school actually know the process exists? Do teachers know what kinds of concerns should be brought forward? Do they know who to talk to or where to take a concern? And do students know where they can go when they're worried about something happening to themselves or someone else? Because a referral pathway only works if people know how to use it. That doesn't mean every teacher or student needs to become an expert in behavioral threat assessment. It means the process needs to be visible, understandable, and accessible to the people who may need to use it. Because the absence of formal assessments doesn't necessarily mean the absence of concerning behavior. Sometimes it simply means those concerns were resolved earlier through appropriate supports. Sometimes it means the concern never reached the team. Those are two very different stories, and understanding the difference is an important part of implementation. And our next reality isn't something that I found in the literature. It's something that I've heard in the schools again and again and again. And it usually sounds something like this. I'm not sure we handled that correctly. Did we need to involve another agency or outside partner? Did we overreact? Did we underreact? I feel like I was making this up as I went. Honestly, when I hear comments like that, I'm not surprised because what people are describing isn't a lack of commitment. It isn't a lack of caring. It isn't even a lack of training. It's the difference between learning a process and living it. Those are two very different things. Every behavioral threat assessment is difficult. Is different. Every student is different. Every family is different. Every team is different. And unlike many responsibilities in schools, there usually isn't immediate feedback telling you whether you've made the right decision. And that's why I actually love this picture, because to me, it perfectly captures the moment when you realize, oh, this is happening now. Not because you're incompetent, not because you're unprepared, but because this is the first time you've experienced this situation with this student under these circumstances. No training can prepare us for every variation. That's where professional judgment begins to develop. And that's also why confidence doesn't come from attending training. It comes afterward. Now, over the course of this work, I found myself asking a different question, not about behavioral threat assessment, not about implementation, about the people living inside implementation. Because as I listened to educators describe these experiences, I started to wonder what happened after someone made the decision to speak up. What happens after a teacher reports a concern? After a counselor raises a difficult question? After a school psychologist recommends bringing a situation to the team? After someone decides, I think we need to look at this more closely. What is that experience actually like? Do people feel heard? Do they understand what happened next? Do they feel supported by the process? Do they trust that their concerns were taken seriously? And perhaps just as importantly, how does that experience influence whether they're willing to speak up again the next time something doesn't feel right? Because if implementation depends on people recognizing concerning behavior, sharing information, and bringing concerns forward, then those experiences matter. They shape organizational trust, they shape confidence, and ultimately they shape whether people continue engaging with the process. That's the question I found myself unable to let go. And it's that question that ultimately became the focus of research that I am doing. Not simply does behavioral threat assessment work, but how does educators' experience with the reporting and response process influence trust, perceptions of safety, and willingness to report future concern? Because I believe the long-term success of behavioral threat assessment depends not only on the quality of the assessment itself, but also on the experience of the people who make the process possible. And I think that's an important conversation for all of us as we continue thinking about what implementation really means. I do want to take a moment here and be respectful of time, making sure that we, okay, it looks like we're still on a good time. Yes?
Yes, we've got, if you want to, a
Okay.
total another 24 minutes to go.
Okay, I just wanted to make
for you
sure.
to use, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So that is the realities. I wanted to, this is a nice pause for anybody who wanted to comment, share, ask a question before we go into the final, essentially, chapter.
I just want to say Lee, who's a South African psychologist who's recently sort of entered the school context, says, thank you so much. As an ex-teacher and new school-based psychologist in South Africa, you've unexpectedly validated the findings you're sharing from our own personal experiences. And then,
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that just touched my heart. You just pulled a heartstring. Please continue.
And then just a comment I plunked in the chat is that, we often unfairly expect, firstly in South Africa, we don't have the luxury of having school psychologists in the majority of schools. In some private schools it might have, they might not be full-time, and maybe some special needs schools. But I think what happens is you also expect that the psychologist automatically knows how to assess threatening, concerning behavior. And as a clinical psychologist myself, I was never trained to do that. I thought I could. When I went into my world of being a qualified psychologist, if I had to ask me, can you tell me if this person's a risk, I would happily have probably given you an opinion. And I'm kind of mortified now because after years of in the field and having special training, I realize that this is not a skill that's a clinical skill. It's a threat assessment skill. So yes, your background as a psychologist is a phenomenal background to have to be trained on top of it as a threat assessor. but just as much is your background as an HR practitioner or as a legal practitioner. And as you mentioned, you know, this is not one person's responsibility, it's a multidisciplinary team responsibility. So I often hear people also say, but we don't have money to employ new people. And that, exactly like you said earlier, you don't, no, none of us who are doing this expected we're going to do this. Sometimes it's forced upon you, or sometimes you fall into it as your interests change, like mine did. You can take people that are in your environment and give them the training. And again, it's not like you have to have experts employed by your school now who are doing this. Most companies are going to take your existing security, HR, legal, whoever, and give them these skills. And they do it as a dual function. And if you're very fortunate, one day maybe a permanent team. So I think that's just some of the, it's just all these things that came up as you were talking.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I'm glad that it's resonating because, you may recall way early in this, none of these questions came out of research for me. What was happening to me every day and as part of, as my career evolved, that's how I got into this. And that's how I realized, oh, I have a bit of a talent for this. And I really started to go in and get that specialized training. But I was just a school psychologist and it landed on my responsibilities. And I appreciate the validation of the work comment because I felt that initially. So I'm glad that this is landing with you folks. And I know that this information can help us all better serve our student populations and whatever population. And that was kind of the hope with this and why I'm grateful for this opportunity to be here with you all today. So now, because I am about the people, we have spent the last several minutes talking about the human side of implementation, and the realities we've discussed aren't problems to eliminate. They're realities to understand. And I think once we understand them, the question naturally becomes, what do we do with that understanding? And I'd like to leave you with a few thoughts that the first are directed towards the systems that support behavioral threat assessment. And then I'd like to end with something for the people doing the work. So if I were thinking about where to begin, one of the strongest themes that emerged throughout my own experience and conversation with other practitioners was the tension we talked about earlier between professional identity and threat assessment responsibilities. We often assume people will simply work through that tension on their own, but I'm not sure that's a fair expectation. In many schools, nobody ever says it out loud. Nobody acknowledges that this role may feel different from why many people entered education in the first place. And my first suggestion is to name that tension before a case ever arrives. Don't wait until someone is sitting in their first high stakes meeting wondering whether they belong here. Talk about it during onboarding. Talk about it at the first team meeting of the year. Help people understand that feeling conflicted at first is normal. At the same time, reframe the purpose of behavioral threat assessment. This isn't something we do to students. It's one of the most structured ways we have to understand what's happening and connect students with support before situations escalate. When people begin to see the student safety and student support as part of the same mission, that internal conflict becomes much easier to reconcile. And finally, make that conversation part of how you prepare every new team member. Don't treat it as an informal discussion. Treat it as part of the foundation of your implementation, because people shouldn't have to discover the human side of this work on their own. And I think that while I'm speaking from the lens of an educator, I think that this translates across organizations for people who end up on the team because of a title. That whole addressing that identity conflict. My second recommendation would be, it does build directly on something we discussed a little earlier. We spend a great deal of time talking about what behavioral threat assessment teams should do, but we spend much less time thinking about how those teams are actually built. In many schools, team membership begins with a job title, and in many cases, that's entirely appropriate. Behavioral threat assessment should be multidisciplinary. The question isn't who belongs at the table. The question is whether we've intentionally prepared the people who are sitting there. Our place to start is by defining the role before assigning it to someone. What decisions will this person be part of? What training is expected? How much time will the role require? What responsibilities come with team membership? Putting those expectations in writing creates clarity before someone ever attends their first meeting. I also think it's worth having an honest conversation before someone joins the team. Not every assignment will be completely voluntary, but people deserve to understand what the role involves and have the opportunity to ask questions before they step into it. And finally, I think we should think beyond proximity. Just because someone's job title places them near the work doesn't automatically mean they're ready for the work. Readiness develops through preparation, support, and experience, because there's an important difference between assembling a multidisciplinary team and intentionally building one. My third recommendation is to rethink about how we prepare people for this work. I say that knowing that there are excellent behavioral threat assessment trainings available. The issue isn't the quality of the training, it's how we're expecting the training to function. Too often, training becomes the finish line, but I don't think it was ever meant to be. Training introduces a process. It creates awareness, it provides a common language, but competency develops differently. Competency develops through practice, through discussion, through consultation, through experience. The teams that seem most comfortable using behavioral threat assessment are rarely the teams with the largest training binders. They're the teams that continue learning together long after the training ends. My next recommendation addresses the two of the realities we talked about earlier today. The time between activations and the possibility that some concerns never reach the team. Neither issue is likely to solve itself. One of the simplest things schools can do is create regular opportunities for teams to practice together before a real case arrives. I'm a big believer in table talk exercises, not because they perfectly replicate real life, they don't, but they give teams an opportunity to think together, to ask questions, to clarify roles, to explore different perspectives, and perhaps most importantly, to become comfortable having the conversation before the stakes become very real. I would encourage schools to schedule a recurring tabletop exercise for every building, every academic year, because practice doesn't simply reinforce the process, it strengthens the team. I also think it's helpful to pay attention to activation patterns by building over time. If a building reports no activations for an entire academic year, I don't automatically assume everything is fine. Instead, I become curious. Was it truly a quiet year? Or were the concerns being addressed somewhere else before they reached the team? Sometimes zero activations reflect the safe schools. Sometimes they tell us something about the referral pathway. Either way, zero activations are worth understanding. They should prompt curiosity and, when appropriate, a closer look at what is happening in the building. My final recommendation may be one that I've come to value the most over time, and that is to make space to learn after the case is over. One of the advantages I've had as an independent evaluator is the opportunity to spend time with teams after an activation and simply reflect together. Those conversations rarely become about finding mistakes. Instead, they become opportunities to recognize what the team was already doing well, to appreciate the relationships that already existed, the supports that were already in place, the thoughtful decisions that were already being made. At the same time, they create space to ask a few consistent questions. Did we follow the process as we intended? What did we learn that we didn't know at the beginning? Where did we lose confidence or clarity, and what can we carry forward into the next case? I found that teams genuinely value both parts of that conversation, the validation that they were doing good work and the opportunity to continue growing together. Over time, those conversations also normalized consultation, not just after a case, but before one begins, during the difficult decision points, and afterward as part of continuous learning. Because none of us sees everything. not individual practitioners, not multidisciplinary teams, not evaluators. That's why I believe the real value of debriefing isn't finding mistakes. It's creating opportunities for reflection, learning, and continued growth. Every case has something to teach us. The question is whether we take the time to learn from it. And we have spent the last several minutes talking about ways organizations can better support implementation. Those recommendations matter. Policies matter, training matters, leadership matters. All of those things help create the conditions that allow behavioral threat assessment to succeed. But I'd like to end somewhere a little different. I'd like to leave you with one final reflection for the people doing this work, because policies don't recognize concerning behavior. Processes don't build relationships. People do. And over the years, I've come to realize that I naturally look at much of my work through the lens of positive psychology. I've noticed that whenever I'm trying to make sense of something, my first question usually isn't just what's wrong. It's also what's strong. What strengths are already present? What helps people do difficult work well? When I began asking those same questions about behavioral threat assessment, I found myself paying less attention to the process alone and more attention to the people carrying it out. Positive psychology didn't change the question I was asking. It just gave me language for something I had been thinking about for years. Because when I think about the very best behavioral threat assessment teams I've had the privilege of working alongside, I don't first think about policies or procedures or protocols. I think about the people. I think about the people who remain curious long enough to ask one more question before reaching a conclusion. People who demonstrate good judgment when situations are uncertain. People who value different perspectives instead of assuming one person has all the answers. People who collaborate. People who continue believing that early intervention can change the trajectory of a young person's life. Positive psychology refers to these as character strengths. They simply describe the qualities I've consistently seen in exceptional educators: curiosity, judgment, perspective, teamwork, hope. I didn't discover those strengths in research. I saw them in classrooms, in conference rooms, around multidisciplinary tables. The research just gave me the language for something I had been witnessing throughout my career. And I think that's important, because those are often the very same qualities that brought people into education in the first place. Behavioral threat assessment doesn't ask us to leave those strengths behind. It asks us to bring them into some of the most difficult moments we experience in schools. When the work feels heavy, it's easy to focus on the responsibility. It's harder to remember the strengths we already possess. And yet, those strengths may be one of the greatest assets we bring to this work. And perhaps that's where I'd like to leave you today. At the beginning of this presentation, we talked about relationships. We talked about schools being uniquely positioned to notice when something changes. We talked about educators making a difference in the lives of young people. And after everything we've discussed, I don't believe behavioral threat assessment changes that mission. I believe it expands it. At its heart, behavioral threat assessment is another way schools care for students. It asks us to notice, to ask thoughtful questions, to bring different perspectives together, and to respond in ways that protect both safety and dignity. The research matters, the policies matter, implementation matters, but over the years, I've become convinced that implementation isn't just an organizational challenge, it's a human one. If we want behavioral threat assessment to succeed, we have to continue investing not only in better systems, but also in the people who make those systems possible. Because in the end, I don't believe the greatest strength of behavioral threat assessment is the protocol. I believe it is the professionals who choose every day to care enough to notice, to ask one more question, and to work together on behalf of young people. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Julie. I just want to see that in the comments, obviously, there's positive stuff, unsurprisingly. Lee has asked, how does she join our special interest group for the education sector? So we've definitely slowly growing people's involvement in this area in South Africa, thanks to your talk. Dan made a very important comment. Every time we do BTAM, it's an opportunity to educate both directly and indirectly. It's especially important, I think, because the management piece goes on for a very long time. I've found that when working with law enforcement partners who are new to BTAM, we often end up talking about an arrest, adjudication, disposition, etc. And it's never the end of the story. The person concerned is unlikely to disappear completely. And if they do fall off the radar, that can be good, bad, or neutral. But a lack of a clear end is often vexing. And I mean, that's so true for any threat assessment. Firing the person, expelling the person, that's not a safety solution. That can place yourself in more danger. You're given a person who already has grievances more reason to hate you. And then you don't know what they're up to, and you have no control over them. And you maybe set them up like a very amazing case study we saw at the recent ATAP conference in Los Angeles. It was about a guy, a very upstanding family in the community, private school, 13-year-old boy, gets accused of making a comment about hurting someone. The school expels him. And there's letters gone out to parents, and in the media it gets out. This kid couldn't even go to a normal public school. And there was never, ever a threat assessment to determine, was it just an inappropriate offhand comment? The kid had no problematic background, perfect student, 13-year-old kid, etc. There was no threat assessment. Yet this kid's life for the next 2.5 years was kind of destroyed. He had to do homeschooling, and eventually he went to university. But that in the story followed him to university. So how the absence of these things is not great, but also kicking someone out of your school, it's not a solution from a safety point of view, and it doesn't help that kid in the long run. And like you said, we have to make this not report to punish, but report to support. And that's the best win-win for everybody. So that's kind of just fitting in with, sorry, I went on top of Dan's comment, but just Dan's original comment. Sorry, Dan. And then just Elzane saying, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. As David mentioned at the beginning, Elzane is one of our leading lights in the special interest group. If you do want to join the special interest group, just pop me an email. I did put my email in the chat. I did put 2 links to 2 of our previous FTAP videos, which one was Aaron Stark. I'm not sure if you ever heard him speak, Julie. He was the guy who was on the pathway to being a school shooter. And he talks about that and how what deviated him from that pathway. And then there was one also that I did about 2 years ago after that school shooting of the principal that I mentioned earlier. So those are freely available for people to watch, and a few resources that I plonked in the chat, some PDFs of just generally well-known I think it's some Secret Service publications on school violence that people can use. And there's a lot of stuff out there. If you ask me or Julie, there's a lot of information that's freely available, which I'm happy to send, and I'm sure Julie would be also.
I apologize.
Yes.
I wanted to put this up there in case I forgot to. I got so excited because it was such a nice, cute ending. I just wanted to put this up there, keeping the conversation going. Contact information if anybody wants to keep the conversation going. And I will give the slide deck, the PowerPoint slides to you, Gerard, and you can share them with them as well, or you can post them.
That's very generous. Thank you so much. Yes, so again, if anybody wants this, because obviously once we're off the chat, I can't see exactly who was on it, who was on the Zoom call. So please do send me that email. My chat is my email is in the chat, and I will send that to you once Julie sends it off to me.
Yes.
Kristen says John Romano is speaking next month as well. People want to register. That seems to be another event. You can click that link that Kristen has put down there. And there's a lot of stuff out there. And I think for the South African crowd, because it's just not been a conversation that we've been having from a threat management point of view, people just don't even know where to get these answers. I mean, most people haven't even heard of the abbreviation BTAM. But you're looking for answers. And this is, again, what people like Julie and FTAP is trying to do, is get that conversation going in the right direction. Because whenever we see some kind of violent incident at the school, my experience, in South Africa at least, my experience is we hear people saying, more discipline. We need to bring back the cane and discipline people with the rod. We need to have zero tolerance and expel people as soon as they do anything wrong. We need to have more security. And these are just the wrong pathways to go down as solutions. But I think for average people out there, they sound so logical. They sound like, yeah, that's the right thing to do. So it gets a lot of traction, unfortunately. And we want the conversation to be one that's actually going to make a difference, that you can actually implement. And it doesn't have to cost a lot of money to do this. To start it off, you just have to have interested people and some basic training. And there's various ways you can get that training that might cost and or might not cost depending on who you approach. So that's important. What else do we have in the chats? Lindell says we'll follow the education, following the education side, assist with red flagging of vulnerable youth in gang violence. I think if a person's displaying any problematic behavior, the system hopefully will pick it up. Julie, what's your thoughts?
So I have seen where we might be involved in a threat assessment, and as we're in that process, we have activated a suicide risk assessment as a part of it. And what they usually will do is we will pause the behavioral threat assessment, address the suicide risk assessment, and then from there move back to the behavioral threat assessment once we've addressed the suicide risk assessment, because that then becomes an elevated risk factor that could be a dynamic risk factor to increase the risk with the threat assessment. And then oh, I'm sorry, you're talking about gang violence. I apologize. I was like, SA, I was thinking suicide assessment. But well, as far as gang violence, I have had a number of cases where I've worked with students who were actively attached to gangs or associated with them. They have a couple different labels. And interestingly, I don't know how much effect it has on their affiliation, association, and their trajectory in that way. I think what it has been most helpful for in terms of the K-12 setting, which is the lens that I'll speak from, is that we have been able to take some students who may have been entertaining the idea of becoming more involved with gangs and moving them down a more positive trajectory. And for those of you who work with gangs, you know, once kids are in, it's very hard to get them out. And that's where, if I was ever to make the plug for recognizing things early, this is why school behavioral threat assessment is so important, because you see them at such a young age before things start to really go awry. And that is where I would say we have the greatest opportunity to disrupt that trajectory and hopefully send them down a more positive path. And this is definitely where I go, not what's wrong, but what's strong. I think that's our best benefit. But in terms of curtailing it on a more global landscape, I would say that it lets you know who they are and have a better watch on them. And if anything, connects you more closely with the other providers who may know about that. So law enforcement, we have shared our threat assessments with local law enforcement who are working with gang or either affiliated or associated gang members. And that is just another piece of information for the larger management of those particular individuals. Hopefully that answered that question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not I definitely don't do risk assessment with youths, but I know for adults, one of the risk factors we would look for is who do they associate with? You know, do you have a positive pro-social friendship crowd or social crowd, which hopefully can be a stabilizer, giving you good advice or a sounding board. But if your social crowd is a negative, bad, involved in violence and criminality, they're probably not going to be the ones saying, hey, Gerard, I don't think you should harass that person. I don't think you should threaten that person. That's not nice. So that might, I don't know if it's the same in the youth context, but it is, I would say for adults, it's definitely a relevant issue is who are you hanging out with and what are they doing to encourage or discourage you from engaging in problematic, threatening behavior? All right, I think we've got this lots of thank yous, excellent talk, appreciate it. A lot of people are asking to be added to WhatsApp groups, etc., which is again, which is why we wanted this in the first place, is to get people's attention. So Julius, thank you so much. Again, I always seem to be saying this like a broken record every time we have one of these presentations at the end is thank you. You know, you've helped us maintain our standard of really impressive, high quality, useful presentations. We'd love to have you back because, as I said, we're trying to get the education sector side of it going. So we do envisage in the future having a more regular, just specific education focused threat assessment webinars in addition to our normal stream of general sort of threat assessment stuff. So, you know, if you ever have other case studies, I think you mentioned a case study earlier. We love case studies to make things real, how these things are implemented, or any other topic, you know, you are definitely welcome to come back. And again, as I said, everybody in the chat is saying, thank you so much, excellent, etc., which is not surprising. So thank you.
Well, and if you have something in particular that your educational or other sector would like to know about, if they give you some feedback on that, I'm sure I have a case, is what I would say. I'm pretty sure I've been through one. So would love to connect with everybody again. We all make this work better. And, I'm about the people. So it's a pleasure to share time with you all.
Fantastic. So thank you once again for everybody. For those of you that are members, this has been recorded, so we'll hopefully have it up in the next few days in the members only section of AFTAP's website. This is an open one. So it will be in an open section. So it'll be on the website, accessible for other people that, we don't want to bar this type of valuable information from schools in the African context. Thanks once again, and have a lovely day wherever you are. It's the start of our day here for Julie and me in the North America hemisphere, and for everybody else who's finishing their day in South Africa and other parts of the world, have a great day, and we hope to see you again at some of our events. So thank you very much.